Well, good evening, everyone. I appreciate you all taking the time to be here. My name is Jonathan. I'm a fellow with the Institute for Faith and Freedom. We're proud to continue our community lecture series. So in keeping with our tradition of making sense of various issues, tonight we're going to have Dr. Coulter here come speak and talk about making sense of state and local politics and the recent midterm elections. So give it up for Dr. Coulter.
So, I'm Michael Coulter. It's nice to be here tonight. I know most of you, and I'd like to meet the ones I don't know. Jonathan came to me a while ago and said something like, "Would you want to participate?" And I thought like some kind of hook of like explainer. Like I like explainers, and so that's kind of where the idea came from. The problem is it's sort of too broad. I should have found a way to narrow it down a little earlier. As I was thinking about, I just sort of threw something out about let's try to understand state and local politics. So here I have some thoughts that I'm going to sort of talk in general about. And in many ways, this is sort of why it's important to study state and local politics and why it's important to participate in various ways. Maybe too obvious of an answer in some ways, but I hope to shed some light. So there's more to it, perhaps. But I also want to begin this way. I think one way to be interested in state and local politics is, or one way to think about it is, are institutions that we participate in, political and social institutions, are they like utterly broken or are they fixable in some ways? Right? And I think there's a kind of divide in American politics that if you think things are utterly broken, then I don't think you would pay a lot of attention to state and local politics. That is, it's not. There's nothing to be gained from it. But if you think that things are fixable in some way, that is, that there's progress that can be made, I think that's one thing that if you take sort of that answer to the question of are things irreversibly broken or are things fixable, then I think you'd be drawn to state and local politics. So, anyways, let me get on. So, what do I? In some ways, I'm asking, sort of thinking about two questions. So why study state and local politics? I teach this course, and even when I teach like the parties and elections course, we spend a lot of time on state and local elections. In fact, that's really the bulk of that course. So why study those things? Why are they important? Because when we tend to look at like national news channels, it's almost exclusively national news. Fox, CNN, MSNBC. It's rarely anything state or local unless it's like some giant, problem or like Flint, Michigan water system not working, and even then it's briefly discussed, or it's how some state or local issue might relate to the national environment. So you cover the Virginia 2021 governor's race, but really it's framed in terms of what does this tell us about the national political environment. So national news don't give us a lot of attention to it. And so you might think, well, where do we get, and other news outlets, I say, tend to pay little attention to it. I do some commentary with Channel 21 on elections, and every once in a while I'll frame it to them like, hey, let me talk about how redistricting affects the districts. And I always get it like, well, could you just talk about this national poll? Or it's a sort of horse race in a national race. Or I remember one night I was in the studio and it was we had time for like one more question, and I think I threw out something like, what might we expect from some newly elected House member, I think in a district. I said, could you just actually talk about who's the front runner for the next presidential election in 4 years? Like it's so distant in some ways, it seems. But even like a local news outlets like Youngstown or Pittsburgh often pay a lot of attention to national news and not to explaining things like districts or local congressmen. And it's really rare to see, for example, a local congressman or a state representative or a state senator on a Youngstown or Pittsburgh news station. And even like the Sharon Herald, let's say, you pick your local newspaper or the Butler Eagle. I'm just picking two local papers. There are some stories about Harrisburg in there, but really surprisingly few, right? And so it's really, in some ways, it's hard to get information, in some ways, about local politics. It doesn't come to us easily. And even when we get down to the local level, We might have a local reporter go to a city council meeting or school board meeting, but even those, that doesn't happen all the time, in part because of cutbacks at local newspapers. Okay, so what's my point is that this initial first point is that at the national level we don't get a lot of attention to state and local politics. But here, let me give you, I'm going to give you 5 reasons why it's important. Then I'm going to turn and talk a little bit about some why it particularly helps us understand these most recent election results. So why study state and local politics? So first is that so much of our policy environment is actually determined at the state and local level. Think of like education policy and criminal justice policy. It's not entirely determined at the state level, but it's mostly determined. There are Supreme Court cases that shape things like death penalty, and you might have a particular type of a penalty that may be prohibited. But in general, states determine those. The criminal justice policy of Louisiana is very different than the criminal justice policy of Pennsylvania. There are far more prisoners per capita in Louisiana, let's say, than in Pennsylvania. Right? And even some things that we might be aware of in terms of criminal justice policy, like 3 strikes and you're out, which was an effort in California to address crime in the 90s. But that started as a state level policy, and not as a federal policy. So some of the innovations, both good or bad innovations, in those areas, start at the national, or start at state level. Charter schools, which we give some attention as important things nationally, started as an experiment in Minnesota, not as a kind of conservative policy. In fact, it was a Democratic state senator who first proposed the idea of a public school of choice, what we now and use helped actually coin the term of charter school. They've been championed mostly by conservatives, but not entirely. But that's just an example of education policy starting there. Other forms of social welfare policy are joint state-federal issues, like Medicaid. Is a joint state-federal issue. States help set some eligibility requirements, for example. And the environmental policy is an interesting case of the federal government can preempt a state's, can override a state environmental policy, but states can have stricter policies on environmental policy. So, for example, air pollution standards, you have what emerged first was actually California started with some strict standards, and you now actually have what are in effect, you have either like the California standard or the federal standard, and the California standard is actually stricter than the federal standard. But so on one level, so why study state and local? That it's an area of a lot of policy activity, and it's obviously doesn't control everything, monetary policy, foreign policy, but much of our sort of day-to-day interaction with public policy comes at the state level. Then another one, and this is the one that really interests me as a political science, is variation in institutions. When we think of national politics, we have the federal Congress, and we are sort of aware of House and Senate and presidential powers, but there's a significant variation, and we can think about the meaning of those variations. So in state legislatures, for example, there are amateur, what are called semi-professional and professional legislatures. So here in Pennsylvania, we have both a very large legislature, state house has 203 members, 50 senators, and it's considered a professional legislature because it has a full-time salary, benefits, and staff, right, or staff, and meets most of the year. But there are some states that have amateur legislatures, that is, they meet infrequently, little pay, little staff, and it's considered a part-time activity. So, for example, the Montana State House is a perfect example of a amateur legislature. It meets only once every other year for a couple of months, and the State House actually you're not paid at all. In the State Senate, it's a couple $1,000s. So that's a completely different institutional model than in Pennsylvania. And there are other kinds of variations that are interesting. New Hampshire has 400 state house members. It's about 1 for every 4,000 residents. Right. Here in Pennsylvania, it's about 1 for every 75,000 residents. California has 80 state house members. which is like 1 for every 450,000 residents. So you have these really significant variations. And then there's even one that's even more remarkable, is that Nebraska actually only has is a unicameral legislature. So they only have a 49-seat Senate. Is what they call it there. It's the unicam in Nebraska. And then you have variations in governor's powers. North Carolina only gave its governor the power of the veto about 20 years ago. So we can kind of think about what does it mean for a governor not to have a veto. Line item vetoes, something that got started, that is where governors could use that to veto portions of bills. That got its start in state legislatures. It was something that was talked about at the national level in the 80s and 90s. It kind of died out. But so what's the significance of these variations? Well, we can make some comparisons and see what these institutional variations mean. So here, I'll give you one. Like some of my very conservative friends would say, it'd be great to have an amateur legislature. Like that's the idea, getting back to the founders. You have limited pay, limited time they meet, and what some political science work on this has said that when you have amateur legislatures, governors tend to be more influential in the policy process, meaning they have full-time staff and they're there all the time, and they have more information so that they can help shape the policy. So, and I've sort of framed this back to some of my conservative friends and say, like, okay, it's fine if you want an amateur legislature, just realize that part of the bargain, part of the trade-off is that you're going to have a more powerful governor. So there's a price to that variation, and that's okay if you want to make that. But it's not. I once had a very conservative friend like, well, why can't they have both an amateur legislature and not have a more powerful governor? And like it doesn't. That's not the patterns we see. That is, you can have this sort of finite amount of power that you distribute between these political institutions. So. And then the other thing we can see is, like we got to test out in terms of institutional variations, term limits. And as some states, like Ohio next to us, has term limits. It's 3 terms in the state House and 2 terms in the state Senate. Pennsylvania doesn't have term limits. And I get the impulse for term limits. Incumbents have significant electoral advantages. But one of the consequences in the state house as well, or probably in state politics, is it does seem to give a little more power to the governor because they have, again, staff that's been around longer, they have institutional knowledge, and the House members aren't as much of a sort of a brake or a counterbalance to the governor's office. Another one that's quite interesting to me is the variation in courts. And I have changed my view on some institutional variations on state courts over time, just because the evidence is quite interesting on this. So here in Pennsylvania, some of you might be familiar that we elect to our statewide appellate courts. We have this state Supreme Court, we have a thing called the Commonwealth Court, and we have the Superior Court, I'm sorry. These are 3 statewide courts that they all handle appeals from counties. Now, we're one of 11 states that have partisan elections for courts. And most state courts, for their the mode of selection for people to these statewide appellate courts is what's known as a merit system. So you have like some entity, usually it's representatives of the bar and some other lawyers and some public officials will nominate people, then the governor picks from that list. And then there's a retention election a few years later. Right? That's a pretty standard mode. It's called it's the Missouri system, as Missouri first adopted it, so they get to claim the name for it. But so here's what we found out from that system: is one is retention elections aren't much of a check on judges. And it's something like 99% of all retention elections, judges get reelected. So if you want to think of an election as a mode of accountability, it doesn't really work. Like no one's really being held accountable if everybody wins. And there's only some very, very unusual circumstances in which someone doesn't win a retention election. But and then what's been interesting is when you can compare states that have elections, particularly partisan election states, you have people who actually, you have citizens who think more highly and respect the courts a little bit more than in states with appointed systems. And political scientists have given some attention to this, what's this phrase or term called legitimacy. The legitimacy is that we accept the political arrangements and we think they work, right? And so I used to be, so here's where this, how I've changed my mind. I used to think that, like, well, it works at the federal level. It's just the governor should appoint judges, and that's we hold, judges hold office during good behavior. If it works at the federal level, why not do it at the state level? But it struck me that the data is pretty strong about in states where they have partisan elections, people in survey data tell us that they accept those institutions more than in states where there's gubernatorial appointment. And for me, I'm willing to take that trade-off. That meaning, like, I want a system where people accept the legitimacy of institutions, that people think they work, and they like this. This is a kind of sense in which they feel to contribute to the system. And I wouldn't have, I would have just accepted the sort of federal model had it not been for some of the evidence. Okay, so this variation in institutions, it's not just a variation we can study, but we can see what it means for how people accept and participate in these things. And there's a ton of variation at local government levels in terms of size of municipal governments, types of strong mayor, weak mayor, council. I mean, it's really quite remarkable, the variation at local level in the United States. Whereas if you look at, say, French local governments, for example, they're fairly well dictated from the national level what their local governments look like. So, sometimes we get some strange arrangements in American life, but we have this really interesting variation that at local government as well. So, and then variations in policy, and I made some reference to this already, but because famously states were said to be laboratories of democracy, where you get to kind of try things out. We try them out in institutional arrangements, but we can try them out in policies. So what I suspect some in the room remember of the welfare reform in the 90s and passed in 1994, that much of the elements of that welfare reform, that is limiting the length of time someone can be on the benefits and increasing work requirements, for example, all happened in states, mostly Wisconsin and a few other states that tried these things, and we could kind of see them at work. I already made a reference to charter schools already, but and some other school choice programs were initiated at the state level in Wisconsin and Ohio, for example. And then a bunch of other states have adopted some versions of school choice, mostly in low-performing schools. Crime policy, we can see some things that work and we can see some things that don't work. And we've, in the 90s, we saw all kinds of attempts to address crime, and there's actually been a sort of pushback against some of those because we saw like significant stress on state and local budgets for those, for having large prison populations, for example. We've seen some other kind of innovations with public-private partnerships. That's really interesting. That if you didn't have some local authority, you wouldn't see this. So in terms of these public-private partnerships, that I'll give you one example. That is, there's a city in California that was considering having a bus system. The city had grown. It makes sense. You have a bus system. Well, they actually did a system where they first, before they could sort of pay the full amount for the bus system, they actually just asked, there's a minimum amount that people had to pay if they were going to like some doctor's offices and library and government offices, is they would pay, actually they'd pay $3 to $5 for an Uber ride. And they would pay a little bit more if they were going to another location besides this. And then they did this the first year and the plan was to eventually get to buy their own buses and have municipal bus drivers and things like that. Well, it turns out that the cost projections they were to provide this ride system was far less than what their cost projections were to run a municipal bus system. And so so that's a kind of public-private partnership. I mean, in one sense, they're subsidizing it, but if someone's riding on a public bus system, you're subsidizing it as well, and you got sort of better satisfaction. And that could be something that could happen at a local government that I can't imagine a policy like that could ever sort of emerge from the federal level. So that's the third one, sort of variations in policy. A fourth point is that state and local governments are like the operating system in terms of our political life. That is, for the most part, we don't even notice they're there. And it's sort of operating in the background that makes things work. And we often only realize that they're there when things aren't working. So, for example, like water and sewage systems are absolutely essential for development purposes, but we only notice them when they go wrong. Right? We talk about Flint and the challenges of not having a functioning water system, but I suspect virtually none of us, and even I, who was a former, borough council member, I rarely ever think about when I turn on the water at my faucet that it's gone through a municipal system, and it works and it's there, and it's not very glamorous to make sure your water system works and your sewage system works. It's incredibly not glamorous, and Don was on council. You probably sat through meetings as well where some engineer was talking about what was needed for a sewage system, and I did my best not to, my eyes to glaze over as I was having some part in a wastewater treatment system explained to me, but it works, and we only notice it when it doesn't work. And that's my analogy there is, again, of the operating system. We don't see it unless it's not working. Okay, and this is really a minor point, but it's often this may seem like a minor point. This is actually a point that Alexis de Tocqueville made in Democracy in America in 1835. He says one of the interesting things about the United States is these lots and lots of local offices, and it was like the primary school for participation in politics. And he says what elementary schools are to science, the higher levels of learning, local government is to political participation. And Tocqueville, I've always been sort of enamored by that passage about it's like we have these lots and lots of elected offices in the United States, and it's a way in which lots more people participate in elective office on a per capita basis in the United States than, again, I'm comparing it to the French system, which you have very few elected local officials. It's mostly appointed officials they have these things that are sort of like counties in the French system. They're much larger than our counties, but they're almost all lifetime appointed officials. Whereas in our system, we have this. It's a way in which we gain experience in democratic politics, small d, obviously. And then, as a kind of subpoint to that, it's often where lots of people get their start. Right? I mean, Carter was a state senator, Obama was a state senator, Bill Clinton was a state attorney general. It's not quite a minor office. George W. Bush was a governor, right? But lots of people, that's where they get their start at state and local government, right? But here, maybe this is the more interesting part for today. I was just trying to make a case for why we should study it and allocate time, and why we should study it more. And I've always failed in my attempts when talking to reporters of you should spend more time on these things, but I'll still keep trying. But I want to turn and talk a little bit about the last election results, because I think that might be more interesting. Is in what way can the understanding state politics help us understand the last election? And so I want to give some illustrations of compare Ohio versus Pennsylvania. Here we are right on the border. If any of us watched any of Youngstown television, we saw tons of J.D. Vance and Tim Ryan commercials, and we heard obviously tons of Fetterman Oz commercials here. Why do we get such different results? J.D. Vance wins. It's almost the exact opposite results of 53-46. It's a little closer in the Fetterman Oz race, and you could argue in some sense, maybe J.D. Vance had a better campaign, was more persuasive, and likewise John Fetterman was more persuasive. But I would argue it comes down largely to this. That is, the exit poll data asks, one of the things it asks is what party do you identify with? And in Pennsylvania, it was amazing that it was 40% of Pennsylvanians identify as a Republican, about 40% identify as a Democrat, and about 20% was independent, although most of that group probably identifies with one party or another, right? Votes most of the time. And in Ohio, it was 40% identify as a Republican, 32% identify as a Democrat, and like 27, 28% as an independent in Ohio. And there's actually a fair amount of data that it breaks down. I mean, it sort of breaks down pretty evenly. People who identify as independent in most states. So, and in each of those states, in Pennsylvania, for example, Fetterman got like 95% of people who identified as a Democrat. Oz got like 93%, right? And the difference, they're about even, and Fetterman did a little better among independents than Oz. That's largely what it came down to. And in Ohio, Tim Ryan got about 95% of people who identified as a Democrat, and J.D. Vance got about 95% of people who identified as a Republican. There's just more Republicans, right? It's a difficult environment for a Democrat to run statewide in Ohio. And then probably 60% of the independents in Ohio probably vote Republican most of the time. So that's why Mike DeWine had an even much bigger victory than J.D. Vance. Right. So what's my point? Is different partisan distribution is that you have, and the political scientists, and it's depressing to me that evidence seems to point this way, but that political scientists have sort of moved to this position over time. In some ways, the evidence says there's not a lot of persuasion that goes on in politics, and what really you have to do is turn out your voters. And so so if you have a larger pool of people who identify with your party, you have a much better shot of winning at the state level. So that helps explain why Fetterman, to me, Fetterman had 8 percentage points more of the electorate in Pennsylvania who identified as a Democrat than Tim Ryan. If Tim Ryan were running in Pennsylvania, maybe Tim Ryan, if we flip that around, right? And we tend to look sometimes at winners of elections and think they are, had some magical campaign and they were super persuasive. It's just that sometimes you have a great home field advantage, to use the sports analogy there. In Florida, where Ron DeSantis had a significant victory, the Republicans, it's shifted over time, but Republicans have several percentage point partisan distribution advantage, right? And flip it around the other way is that it would be almost impossible to win statewide in California just because of the partisan distribution there. So, I think news media likes to pay attention to campaigns or some kind of important event, in a race, what a candidate said or did, or a certain piece of advertising that was used, and wonder if that's is the key to explaining the election. And in general, political scientists will say it's the state political environment that helps us understand the outcomes, right? So, and then we can. So that's one part of why understanding states are important, is the overall state environment. But the other reason I think it's important to help us explain some elections. So one is I guess knowing the overall distribution. I'll be clear about that. But it's also really interesting to understand the distribution within a state and how those things shift over time, and that provides some explanation to us. So here I'll tell a story about Pennsylvania, or at least describe it. If you compare the presidential election result in 2012 with the election results in 2022, to me this is a really interesting outcome, is that Fetterman's win of like 51.5 to 47 was almost identical to Obama's percentage differences in 2012. But one thing we've seen, virtually all the states sort of north of Interstate 80 have had a higher percentage of voters for Republicans, and places around Pittsburgh and the whole southeastern corner, that is Philadelphia and the so-called collar counties like Bucks and Montgomery and Berks County, are all much bluer, right? So we're trying to understand Pennsylvania results. We think about overall distribution, but we also think about like the shifts within a state. And so so we might be living in an area where we might think, look, how did Fetterman win? Everybody I know around here, voted for Republicans, or all I see is Republican signs. And what I tell to some of my Republican friends or activist friends is, go drive through parts of Allegheny County, or go drive through Montgomery County. What used to be a kind of fairly reliable Republican area in Montgomery County is now very different. And what that meant for Pennsylvania is something that caught me by surprise, although when chatting with some of my friends who work in state politics, they were not as surprised. But Pennsylvania, it's pretty complicated, but it looks like there'll be 102 Democrats in the state House and 101 Republicans. What makes that complicated is that 2 Democrats are elected to a higher office and may have to shift or will need to resign. And in Allegheny County, they actually elected someone who was dead, but that was because he died just before the election. It was past the time when you could change the name. So, and he had been in the state House since like 1982. But so really, there's in some ways there's 102 Democrats and 101 Republicans, and that's a big shift because there were 112 Republicans and 111 Republicans, right, and 112 and 91 prior to the election. But the 2 things that happened is we had a redistricting. So in Pennsylvania, we have a 5-member, essentially it's a commission. There's 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and it had the former chancellor of University of Pittsburgh, who approved a map for state House and state Senate districts. And so that redistricting plan wasn't, strongly run by one party or the other. And the population in the state has shifted eastward. So eastern Pennsylvania continues to grow and western Pennsylvania is not. But most of those newly configured state House districts, that's where the location where these dozen or so new state House members come from. And really it shouldn't have been, when I was going over the results on the day after the election, I was surprised, but I shouldn't have been surprised because of the population shift in the state, the partisan preference shift. So a bunch of those new districts are in places like Montgomery County and Bucks County. So one is by studying states, we can understand something about, we can really understand why we get the partisan results we do. And I think that's a better way of explaining it, or gets us to it. It's not as interesting as studying somebody's ad campaign, but that's sort of how things get done. So, and I think you could go through and look at some other surprise elections, like in Arizona. Conservatives were drawn to candidates like Blake Masters and Kerry Lake, but that's a state that's almost evenly divided, and the kind of campaigns they operated would almost certainly have fit in an environment that was more strongly Republican. Like I think Kerry Lake would have won in Florida, but she didn't win in Arizona because the electoral environment is different. It's not that necessarily that Ron DeSantis was simply a better candidate than Kerry Lake, for example. So anyway, that's I guess so. A couple things is like the partisan difference, the partisan distribution, I think is the key to explaining electoral outcomes. It doesn't mean that campaigns don't matter. They don't matter as much as we think they do, right? Or as we might expect them to do so. So, and then I want to leave some time for questions and answers. But I want to come back to the thing I said at the beginning of like, do you think things are sort of broken? Actually, no, I'm sorry. I wrote down the other thing I want to turn to is it with elections. This only partially explains elections, but it helps us think about like the role of elections and the administration of elections. We had a lot of questions about elections after 2020. Lots of questions were raised about the legitimacy of elections or how they worked. And some states were able to address like some of the procedures for counting votes. And so in Pennsylvania, I want to draw attention to it, is that we prepared, the parties played a better role this time in trying to help people understand how to vote by absentee ballot or mail-in ballots, At the county level, they, at most counties, they were preparing absentee ballots to be counted on the day of the election rather than waiting till the next day. And so these were changes that, only people sort of really obsessed with elections were paying attention to. And this is good because, for example, we had in Mercer County, we had all of the absentee or mail-in ballots counted on election evening by late. It was a late night, but by making that change, you got the results sooner, and I think you gave greater confidence in the system. And there was I think that happened sort of. It left a fewer sort of openings for questions about the legitimacy of the system. So that's not really it doesn't explain the partisan distribution, but like states do run these elections, and I think they have an important responsibility in helping people be confident in election results. So, okay, those are just some quick thoughts about like why we should care about state and local politics. And why it should be given more attention in the media and in some of our news consumption. But I want to, John told me to go for about a half an hour. I think I've gone for about a half an hour. But I'd love to answer questions, and we could talk about the election or particular state policies if you want. But Robert.
So when, can you put a time period on when the partisan stuff happened, right? Like in the 80s election, Reagan won 49 states. Now it seems like we're in this place, and if it is just partisan in turnout,
Yeah.
we're going to have these three purple states every time, right? Georgia and Arizona and
Sure. Pennsylvania.
When did that happen? What made that?
Sure. In one sense, if we knew someone's partisan identification, it's actually been the best predictor for 50 years, right? Except in some unusual cases, like in some ways, the '84 election is a little bit of an outlier in that case. And Reagan did win 49 states, but some of those states he won, 53-47 or something like that. But and you can go to the '72 election that Nixon won with nearly 60% of the vote. But there's one political scientist who's sort of done more work and it's on this, and her argument, and the data kind of seems to show it, is that it went from being a very good predictor of vote behavior to a really, really good predictor, meaning like, maybe partisanship would explain, that 85% of people who identified with a party would vote for that party. Now it's 95%. And that partisan switching, right, or shifts tend to be rarer than in the past, right? So it becomes a kind of solid identity.
It's like a team, right?
It's teams, yeah. And mostly this sort of emerged in the mid to late 90s is the sort of argument, and that we've become, it's almost, like in the World War I, we had this trench warfare where you get these armies that are in pretty similar spots, and they kind of are, it's little slight shifts back and forth of where the battle lines were. And that's largely what we've had since the late 90s. We've had, think of how close, obviously how close the 2000 election was, but there was only a handful of states that shifted between 2000 and 2004, and not a lot we've had a few states who've shifted, but really there's only a handful of states where it's, and it really isn't that different in 2020 to 2016. These are a couple of percentage point shifting here or there that explain some of these differences. So it's really a phenomenon where it's become more solidified is in the last 25 years. But there's these famous studies in the late 1950s called the American Voter Model, where they're looking at people's choices in presidential elections, and partisanship explains 80% of it. Now it's 95% of it. So, Jeff?
Are there opportunities in local politics, you think, for people to support a candidate who's maybe unusual? I think this gets back to the information problem you're talking about, right? Like, it's hard for me as a newcomer to the area to find information for papers that show the sparks.
Yeah.
Like
I know.
But is there an opportunity for somebody who's, I don't know, break out of the partisan side on a local level, if there might not be an acting president?
Sure. Now, some states, mostly Western states, have nonpartisan elections for local government. So just a matter of collecting signatures and running for city council. And so you tend to get a little more ideological variation in some of the Western states. Like you'll get Green Party and Libertarian Party, people who, that's the party they identify with, but they're on, a city council or county commission of some kind or county council. Most of the states on the east of the Mississippi have partisan elections for local government. But even because there's so little competition at the local government level, you'll sometimes get people who aren't, sort of, you might say, in the mainstream of their party. And so that leads to a little variation or unconventional participants in local government, in part because they're not, hotly contested. Now that can be good or bad. I mean, you can get some people who may not understand sort of what the job involves, but it allows for some opportunities at the local level that wouldn't exist. And you can have pretty low cost. Like, it's very clear that the cost for running for state house is far more than it was 30 years ago, for example, in most states. So even that, you might think of that as a kind of entry-level position. But the cost for running, city council races, county council races in counties that have councils are still pretty low. And so the cost of entry to participation is within reach. But I think you're getting to a kind of the other issue you raise is like the challenge of getting information about local government. I do think one of the things that's been helpful, and I wish that more local governments kind of saw it as a particular duty, but like making it easy to find minutes of meetings, to stream meetings, even if nobody is watching them and so forth. And saw that as a kind of duty as office holder at the local level. And it's an extra expense and hassle to do those, and none of us likes to see ourselves on video, including the one that's being shown here. But I think there's a civic duty, I would argue, at the local government level to provide information. And a long time ago, I once had some students do a project where they evaluated local governments just in Western Pennsylvania, and it really was a range of clearly some local governments saw it as a responsibility to make it easy to get information, and other local governments, not that they were trying to make it hard, but they didn't make it easy. Right? It was really hard to get access. So, and I think that ultimately, local governments have a duty to kind of engage with the press, and it's the way we can communicate. And that's hard because I think sometimes you'll get misquoted by the press or something like that, or you think you got treated badly. But anyway, that's another issue. Yes, sir. Thanks for coming.
I have a question, but I'm not sure how I can ask this question. It has to do with campaigning.
Sure.
Because if you're interviewing for a job, usually you have a resume, you have a pretty good background, you have experience, you have education, you have something in there that some employer is going to see that's a good thing for that company.
Yeah.
When you're looking to vote for somebody and there's a campaign, the ads that you see on television don't really tell you anything about the candidate. It's bad-mouthing each other, which doesn't do any good for the general public, because the general public is going to make a bad decision because the information's not there. So basically, if you're looking, in my opinion, if you're looking to elect somebody in a public office, how do they think? Because if there's information given, if you're in office at the time, you're going to be given information at the time, and you're going to have to act on it, make a decision, and so on. And you really want to know how that candidate's going to think down the road. I don't really care if they're a Democrat or Republican or independent. I'm curious to how they're going to reach a decision, and that's the part that you never get to see. And most of the time, when they reach a decision, it's pathetic. So
your question is important and interesting, and also slightly depressing. What I'm getting at, no, it's just true, is that from the campaign consulting side is they realize that if anything, what they can do is they can convince someone who leans towards a party to turn out and vote. Like the persuasion occurs not switching from one party to another, except in very rare circumstances, but it's in, do I get someone who leans towards the candidate of the party of my candidate to go from being a non-voter to a voter. And so if I have limited resources, the best way to use those limited resources in a campaign is to get someone from my party to turn out. And so that doesn't, from the campaign consulting end or campaign side, their objective is to get somebody elected, and that's the means they have of getting more votes, is turning out their party.
So they're not paying attention to the short, medium, and long-term effect. They're basically looking at the short-term effect.
Sure, and from the people who run campaigns, like their job, and they're judged, for future jobs, and is did they get somebody elected?
It is depressing. You picked the right word.
Yeah, and I wish, there's that old adage that democracy is the worst system except for all the others, right? And so on one hand, I am interested in elections and campaign stuff. I'm also very much interested in democratic theory and what does it mean to be a citizen, and so if I spend too much time on the kind of democratic theory and what it means to participate in elections, that's where I get a little bit depressed. Is there's not a lot of demonstrable exercise of weighing candidates, so it's hard to get that information, hard to do anything with it. And what turns out to move most voters is partisan identity, and you'll notice that we frame elections, or campaign spots are framed because, unfortunately, a fair amount of psychology tells us that people are moved more by fear than by prospects of hope. And so, if this candidate's going to do something bad, that's going to get, the other party's candidate's going to do something bad, that might be the thing that gets me to go from being a non-voter to a voter. And there's actually there's a whole set of findings from psychology that you'd be surprised how much it influences the campaign side of how they shape ads and things like that. So, John?
Do you think that one of the reasons Dr. Oz lost is because many Pennsylvania Republicans felt, by and large, that they didn't have a good reason to vote for him, and that the only reason they were really voting for him was because they wanted to vote against John Fetterman, or do you think that doesn't?
Well, so Oz got, in terms of self-identifying Republicans in Pennsylvania, Oz got 92% of them. And now Fetterman got 96%. And that's, exit polls, that's pretty close, right, to both of them. So Oz did get self-identifying Republicans. He almost certainly got some Republicans who voted Shapiro, the Democratic candidate. There's some Shapiro-Oz voters. We can see that in some of the precinct data, and particularly in southwestern Pennsylvania. Where Oz it seems to be, he lost among people who self-identify as independent. And now, could Oz have done a better job in Mastriano of turning out Republican voters? There probably were some Republican voters who weren't, they weren't contacted enough, didn't see enough ads. It's also, here's another thing, it's a little bit depressing, is where there's more campaign spending, there's actually higher turnout. And so we might not like campaign spending, but it actually helps move voters from non-voters to voters. So the Mastriano campaign spent very little in the state, and they probably didn't have as good of a turnout operation, and that probably was a bit of a drag on Oz, at least a little bit, if you're thinking of trying to explain the Oz result. And probably some of the non-political things, like Oz not being a longtime resident of the state, that might have resonated well with independent voters who didn't have strong partisan preferences. It turns out that they actually did a pretty good job of reaching out to Republicans. There's a former Grove City grad who was Oz's deputy campaign manager, and we chatted different times during the race. Mostly he called to tell me funny stories, which is fun. And when you're driving across the state of Pennsylvania in the middle of the night, you call people to stay awake. But he would tell me about in certain settings, like Oz did really, really well in, Republican, county dinners and things like that, right? He, had lots of experience on engaging with people on television and other settings. But so he seemed to resonate with Republican, at least, at those kinds of, at the activist level. And they were willing to sort of look aside the not being a longtime resident or, on those issues. So, anything else? John? Oh.
We're not talking about candidates, but a decision down in Shenango Valley. Were you surprised at all by the merger of the city permitting to Wheaton?
Oh, so this, no, in fact, like that was, I have this view that I think the state government should subsidize mergers, meaning like incentivize it, like, throw out some, 1 year property tax reprieve to encourage it, or something like that. So Wheatland, how it ever became a separate borough is beyond me. It's a little tiny thing, and it's, I think there were 3,000 or 4,000 residents of Wheatland Borough. And that it had it also didn't have a lot of debt, municipal debt. That's the thing that hinders like mergers between, it was they absorbed Wheatland as in, rather than a pure merger. But so one of the things that there are, there's something like 5,000 local governments in Pennsylvania, if I get the number right. That includes every, township, borough, county, special district, school district, et cetera, right? There's a ton of them. And they might have had a good reason why they were established in the first place, 120 years ago or something. But they, and it's really hard to initiate that merger process. And so I think there might be some gains in the long run by like incentivizing, partially wiping out the debt or something, to have some mergers. I think probably you get some better local services and, and that's what really hinders like school district mergers is that no one wants to be the school. It's the schools that are indebted are often the ones seeking to merge with somebody else, and nobody wants to welcome in their debt. Like that's as much of a hindrance as local attachment to districts. But so that's an interesting case, and that was much more likely. I can't quite remember how long ago it was, maybe 15 years ago. It was on the ballot to do a study of merging 5 municipalities in the Shenango Valley. It might have been 2005 or 2007, but that in that case, that was sort of too complicated of a merger, and only one of the 5 municipalities had to vote against it for it not to happen. So, like that was setting up a too hard of a process. But yeah, this was an interest. You don't see this very often. That is, small municipalities merging. We actually have. By the way, in nearby Lawrence County, it's just a fun fact, we have this incredibly tiny borough that has like 50 residents, the SNPJ, that really was, it's a kind of quirky story of how it gets started, but like, and it's really not that much of a cost, but sometimes these smaller local governments are a hindrance to like functional roads that connect larger municipalities, and they sort of outlive their usefulness. So I rambled on too long about that question. So I realize, I'll say this in closing, that I realize in some ways like the detail of local government and state government isn't always exciting, but it does certainly influence our lives. It affects development. It can't shift large it can't change the cost of gas prices. Or inflation or something like that. But it can have an impact on those larger economic and social trends, and it can change like how desirable a place is to live in ways that are almost sometimes a little bit invisible or in the background. And that's why these things are important and why it's good for citizens to be engaged at this level. Yeah.
Can we ask more than one question? Can you stick around?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Well, we'll probably wrap up this portion, but Dr. Cole will stick around.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Oh, yes.
It's not an easy
Oh,
thing to
no.
talk about.
No,